Okay, we have a lot to cover today, so let's go ahead and get started. So once again, thank you for joining us. My name is Kimberly Tucker and I am your moderator today. I'm the Director of Marketing here at DSD, and I will simply be representing the company at large and introducing our presenters and our agenda. So today we have Sean McMahon, who is our Business Development Manager for the Intacct practice, Eric Anderson, who is the Director over all Sage Consulting, and Andres Travis, who is Senior Consultant for our Intacct practice. And those three will be going through the agenda items, which includes why the cloud matters, Intacct as a whole, and the Sage 100 versus Intacct comparison, which I think is the majority of what you guys are interested in today, but you are going to be wowed by the demo and how amazing Intacct has been created for nonprofits. And then we'll go ahead and review one of our migration client success stories and take questions and answers at the end. So really excited you're here. Please feel free to use the chat option here within GoToWebinar. There should be a questions area where you can actually interact with myself. And if possible, we will address everything in that Q&A session. If for some reason there's an in-depth question that requires follow-up, we'll absolutely reach back out. So don't hold back. We're happy to have you live and in person today. Just to give an overview of the company, we are DSD, which many of you know because you are our Sage 100 clients, but our company is celebrating 40 years in business this year. So we are thrilled. We are a top Sage 100 partner, top Sage partner as well. And we actually adopted Intacct into our fold of Sage products about 8 years ago, I believe. So we are one of the premier dual authorized partners, and you are in very good hands here in this webinar because we obviously have a massive base of Sage 100 and lots of experience within that product line and developing, but also expanding into the cloud. We have really invested in our Intacct practice and also expanding in the tech partnerships as well. So we're super proud of both sides of the business, or all sides of the Sage relationship. And we really hope that the future is bright for all of you within this Sage space, and that we're there for you along the way. So with that, I will actually pass to Sean, who is going to give you a deep dive into why the cloud's important and how the products have really supported the technology changes.
Thanks, Kimberly. Now, I know you all have heard the words digital transformation thrown around a lot, and like any buzzword that gets tossed around in the media, the original message gets diluted and starts to lose some meaning. That said, we spend a lot of time talking to our clients about the challenges that they experience, and from what they've shared, we can assure you that digital transformation is a very real thing. So why is it so crucial? For a start, as anyone who's had to pay for server space or upgrades can tell you, the size and scale of data produced by modern systems has grown exponentially. In tandem, the tools needed to store and analyze that data have grown increasingly complex. And you may find a lot of the systems that you've relied on in the past are no longer up to snuff. We've also seen through COVID that remote work is a viable way for companies to operate. But once again, you need the correct tools to be able to do so. One of the unforeseen advantages that came about during remote work is that a lot of companies realized during that specific economic downturn was that you can run an organization more efficiently. It no longer became a goal or an initiative, but really a key factor in survival and remaining competitive. But the complexity doesn't stop there. Many of you also have to deal with a constantly shifting sea of regulations and compliance requirements that you just can't effectively manage with your existing tools. And finally, we all see the stories about the increases in cybercrime. We hear it from our customers every day. There are some very real security threats out there, and you need to make sure that you have the right tools to protect your business. So why does the cloud matter? An obvious solution to many of the things we talk about is a move towards the cloud, but it's worth a second to pause and take a minute to ask why. Why does the cloud matter? An important thing to understand is that as a model, the cloud offers a lot more transparency and predictability than a traditional on-premise environment. With an on-premise model, it may have a lower initial licensing cost, but that cost really only includes 9% of the overall cost of using that software. A full 40% of that cost of that solution is hidden in the hardware required to run it and the human resources needed to manage it. You also face hidden costs to apply fix, to upgrade it to stay current, and just to keep the ship running. Moreover, these things can change suddenly and without warning. Say Microsoft releases an update that breaks something else in your system, or something you've grown to rely on goes end of life, or a server goes down. With cloud, the maintenance, upgrades, and fix are all built into the upfront costs that you can easily predict what you're going to spend on a given solution, as it's all built into the subscription price. So what is Sage Intacct? Let's talk about that a little bit. There are multiple reasons why we're so excited about Sage Intacct here at DSD, but at a surface level, there are a few things we'd like to highlight. You gain easy, valuable, real-time insight into your financials with dashboards and the ability to drill down all the way to the transaction level. It has best-in-class, scalable applications with integrations that won't break with upgrades. And speaking of those upgrades, and we'll touch on this in a little bit, they roll out automatically every quarter and bring updated functionality at no additional charge. Because it's in the cloud, you can access it from anywhere, be it your phone, a tablet, your kitchen table, on the beach, basically anywhere you have internet access. Intacct also brings the power of dimensional accounting, which we're also going to go into a little bit more detail in a second, with the ability to automate intercompany transactions and multi-currency reporting. Really, for all these reasons and many more, Intacct is the only AICPA endorsed solution for cloud accounting and the #1 solution in customer satisfaction from a wide range of sources and metrics, all like you see below. There also is an ongoing customer community that's being built where you have the opportunity to exchange ideas and different improvements that you'd like to see in software with other Intacct customers. So it's really great to see that coming together and have that ability to interact with other Intacct users around the world. So I'm going to pass it over to Eric Anderson, who's going to walk through the comparison between Sage 100 and Sage Intacct.
Thanks, Sean. Thanks, Kimberly. So before we dive into the comparison, I always need to preface this discussion with Sage 100 is an amazing application. Many of you love it, and we at DSD definitely love it and support it. It's currently our largest practice, and we have the largest Sage 100 consulting team in North America. However, it wasn't built for nonprofits. So when we look at the comparison list, you're going to see a lot of things that are not native to Sage 100, but are built into Sage Intacct as part of the solution. So let's go to the comparison overview slide. Okay, on-prem versus cloud. That's pretty straightforward. Sage 100 is an application. We can install it on a server. We can install it on a virtual machine in the cloud, and we do a lot of that with Sage Partner Cloud. But it's still different from Sage Intacct, which is native cloud. Grant tracking, billing, compliance tracking, this is all built into Sage Intacct. Nothing third party. It's just baked in. Dimensions and dimensional tagging. This is really the true power of Intacct, and the result is that we can easily slice and dice this dimensional data on dashboards and reports. And you're going to get to see what that looks like in a minute with the demo. And then finally, pricing. So I just sat in on a Sage webinar last week that discussed their new not-for-profit pricing. They have discounts off the base pricing, or they are also introducing a bundled pricing model, which contains some of the most commonly requested modules, features for nonprofits at a significant discount. So let's move on to regulatory compliance. On the Sage 100 side, let's see. There we go. Okay.
Oh, sorry, Eric. Go ahead.
No, next slide. So regulatory compliance. I'm still seeing the comparison overview. Yeah, there we go. So on the Sage 100 side, I can sum up compliance in one word, and that word is workarounds. When I started thinking about how organizations get Sage 100 to meet their nonprofit requirements, an image came to mind of a very old car driving down the road with 1 or 2 missing windows, and you got the plastic over the window. You've got duct tape holding the bumpers on, and some of the lights and blinkers aren't working. The dashboard isn't really doing a great job of telling you where you've been or where you're going. And we've all seen those cars and wondered how they can even drive. But at the end of the day, they get people from point A to point B. It's functional, but it's barely hanging on. And some of you might feel like you're in that car right now with your current system. So what do these Sage 100 workarounds typically look like? We see some organizations that are using separate systems or Excel files to track what they need and ensure compliance. Others are trying to modify Sage 100 to capture the necessary data. So these modifications could be, with sub-accounts on the general ledger, which can lead to very lengthy, messy chart of accounts, and/or customization, which could include custom office using user-defined tables or user-defined fields to accomplish their goals. So we have two custom report writers. There's Crystal Reports inside of Sage 100, and then there's also Sage Intelligence, an Excel-based tool. So in general, we're seeing a lot of workarounds on the Sage 100 side. With Sage Intacct, when we provision a new environment, we have to specify a business type template, and this determines the account categories and the financial reports that are created out of the box. One of these template options is not-for-profit. So we're baking in some core elements of the nonprofit structure when we spin up your environment. Now it's just a starting point, and you can still make changes and modify the structure of your accounts and reports. And you can specify your dimensions, which we're going to get into a little bit more, but it's an extremely helpful launching point. For instance, some of the pre-built reports in Intacct are the schedule of expenditures of federal rewards and the 990 worksheet, which is the statement of functional expenditures. And there are dozens of other canned reports. Most of the fields under the Sage Intacct column on the right here are just baked in, but we also have the ability to add custom fields similar to Sage 100. So let's skip to the next slide. We'll talk about dimensions. Dimensions are the underlying building blocks that make Sage Intacct such a great reporting and dashboarding tool. It's similar in some ways to a sub-account, but much more flexible. Because in order to use a sub-account in Sage 100, it has to be part of a full account. So the more sub-accounts you need, the longer and more complex your chart of accounts gets. In Intacct, all you really have is the main account, and then you have your dimensions, which are separate fields available on your transaction entry screens. A dimension can be a department, a location, a grant, an employee, a vendor, a customer, et cetera, et cetera. You can have user-defined dimensions, but all of these dimensions are not required on all transactions. So for instance, you can pick and choose which dimensions you want to require on a journal entry. And that might be different than the dimensions that you want to require when entering your AP bills. And you can create dimensional relationships as well. So an example might be, if the location equals X, then I only want departments 1, 2, or 3 to be available. Looking at the slide here, reducing the complex chart of accounts, improve visibility and transparency, and even the ability to track restrictions, which we'll talk a little bit more about. Let's go to the next slide and we'll discuss general ledger. Inside of your journal entries and other transactions, you'll be tagging dimensions, and this all flows through to the general ledger, which has options for dimensional reporting on reports and dashboards, multi-entity management, multiple books. For instance, you can have accrual and cash books, and it really helps you close more efficiently because a lot of this inter-entity do to, do from, it's just baked into the system and happening behind the scenes when you're making transactions. So the multi-entity and even global consolidations are just built into the architecture. One of the biggest advantages of Intacct that we see with our clients, and they give us accolades about this, is the time savings during the closing process. Okay, let's talk about restriction release, the next slide. So in Intacct, when setting up our dimensions, we can define the restrictions tied to your different grants, funds, projects, programs, however you'd like to define your dimension. And again, this is just part of Sage Intacct, it's built in. There are also pre-canned reports that can give you insights into restricted versus unrestricted funds. And we'll see some of this in the demo as well. And then just 2 more slides. I know you're anxious to see the demo. So integrations. Let's talk about that for a second here. Both applications have a lot of integration options, but on the Sage 100 side, We tend to see more of this happening with manual processes like importing a CSV file with Visual Integrator. On the Intacct side, we see more seamless, completely automated integrations due to that modern open API. For example, if you're a nonprofit using Salesforce, there's a pre-built integration between Sage Intacct and Salesforce. They've been partnering around this integration for many years, working hand in hand, and it's a very solid, seamless integration. So we do have integration options for Sage 100 and Intacct. What we see on the Intacct side is more partners willing to integrate with that Intacct because it's a little bit easier due to that open modern API. And one more slide, and we'll talk about system upgrades. So on the Sage 100 side, if you're a Sage 100 user, you're used to this process. We're going to scope out an upgrade. We're going to present you a price to perform the upgrade. We're going to install the new version of Sage 100 in a new location on your current server, or possibly you need a new server, and we have to install it there if your old server doesn't meet the current requirements. Then we perform most of our upgrades in 2 steps. So step 1 is we're going to install Sage 100. We're going to migrate data from the old version of Sage 100. We're going to convert the data from Sage 100. We're going to test custom reports, test any integrations, third-party add-ons, train on the new features, user acceptance testing. And then once we get the sign-off from our client saying, yeah, we feel like we're good to go, step 2 is we re-migrate the data, we convert it again, and we go live on the new version. So it is a process, very different than what happens with Intacct. Intacct, you won't know. You'll get to work one Monday morning and you'll have an alert that says, hey, your system's been upgraded. You'll have a link inside of Sage Intacct that says, here's what you can expect with this new quarterly release. Andres is going to show us that in just a minute here. And so there's nothing to do on your end. There's 4 quarterly releases. They're adding a lot of new features with every release, and there's no complex process to upgrade. So I think that's it for me, and we can hand it over to Andres, and you can see a great demo of Intacct for nonprofits.
Thanks, Sean. Eric, sorry. So here we go. So I'm just going to share my screen. And so we're going to take a look at Sage Intacct. So right now, if you can see, I'm actually working in Chrome. And so Intacct, since it is a cloud solution, there's browser compatibility with all of your modern browsers. So if you're using Chrome, if you're using Edge, if you're using Firefox, if you're using Safari, right? As long as you have a valid user with password and it's active, you can access Intacct. It can be used on a Windows machine, it can be used on a Mac, right? You can even, if you have a big enough tablet, you can log in through a tablet. Looking at the homepage, so there are a couple things that I'd like to call out. So like Eric mentioned, with the 4 quarterly releases, Intacct puts it all out there for you to see. And so, for example, R2 came out earlier this month. You could always see the release notes directly from the homepage. They're all here. You can get into the calendar. You can go note by note. You can go region by region. You can even watch, they have short videos in terms of each individual update or release, or you can kind of watch it all together. So for example, all of R2, they summarized in this 16-minute video so that you can have kind of a quick view. There's also an embedded help and support. So for example, the help center. Once you have access to Intacct, you can get to it a couple different ways, either from this link down here under help and support, or at the top right in the same heading, we have Sage University in the help center. So the help center gives you a ton of help articles where if you were trying to do something specifically, you can even pull libraries. So let's say, for example, if 1099 season comes around, I wanted to figure out how to run the 1099 report because I haven't seen it in a very long time and I just needed a refresher. I could always look it up, and it goes detail by detail, what I'm supposed to see, before I start, what I want to make sure I do, how to run the report, and it even includes, what subscription should I have in order to get to this, and what user type and permission set do I need. So all of that is at your fingertips. You have Sage University as well, so you can slide into that, and so that's Intacct's, learning center, where if you wanted either self-paced videos like the ones for 1099 or full training resources, you could go through there. And you also have the community like Sean mentioned, right? And so you can, all that is right there within Intacct. All right. And so if we then start, so we're going to be bouncing around a little bit, but what I want to take a look at first is we're going to go to our projects or grants. And so we were talking about earlier, where in Intacct can we see and track, different compliance information, whether it be for a particular grant or something like that. And so, for example, I'm going to edit this Skokie Foundation Award. And so Intacct has specific standard fields, they call them grant fields. So for your SEFA schedule, where if we needed to track the assistance provided, right, that's a defined dropdown, it's cash or non-cash, the payer, federal or third party. You can bring in the funded name, the ALN, the agency, and any other ID. Those are standard fields. We can make them required by introducing logic in the system, or we can kind of just leave them for folks to fill it in. We also have restriction information here as well. And so it's also tracked into dimension, which we'll look at in a second. But if on a specific project or grant, I wanted to track the type of revenue restriction, if it's purpose-based, time-based, or if it's just not applicable. That revenue restriction being purpose, if it's time-based, how many years, when did it start, when is it going to expire, when is that first restriction release going to happen? I could do all of that. There's checkboxes that I can introduce here in terms of, was it scheduled? Was the release, finished? Did it complete? And then any standard field or custom fields that I want to add, I can do that. And so Intacct then also gives you platform services where if I wanted to add a custom field, it's point and click, right? I can choose if it's going to be just a text field for like a comment. I can also choose, if this is going to be a drop down or a multi-select, right? Couple other fields on the project or grant. We could also tie this to a category, a grant type, and ultimately to a funder or donor, right? So all that information is kind of tied together and you're not piecing those, in Excel or somewhere else. So then any one of those fields can ultimately show up on reports. So for example, in my other tab, so I have a dashboard here, and what we're going to look at is the SEFA detail report. And so I'm just going to push this out into another window. And so because it's browser based, it's pretty simple. I can push it out, I can zoom in, I can zoom out, whatever I need. But in terms of the reportability of all these different fields, in this specific report, I'm showing my grants as my dimension, right, in my rows. So I can look at Slytherin, I could look at Rural Health Network, right? And then these are the individual values that are coming from that actual project. If I have an agency listed, that funded program name, the ALN, the other ID, a contract amount, and then in this case, I'm also bringing in my current year and prior year expenditures, right? If from a review standpoint, I wanted to look at this and say, hey, let me double check this health initiative one for my grant year 3, I can click on that link. Anything that's a blue text is a hyperlink, and then it opens up that project or grant. So then I can kind of go through here, right? All of this has a full audit trail. And so for example, under more actions, I can view the audit trail. I can see if something was created. This is a demo environment, so some of these just kind of copy over. And then from the report, ultimately, I can drill down to the underlying general ledger if for whatever reason I was looking at, that amount and thinking, maybe that seems a little bit too high. I want to see kind of where all that activity is coming from. I want to see what expenses are included in that expenditures column. I can see all that here. So, for whatever reason, Ben Affleck's doing a lot of travel, so I spent a lot there. All right. And so ultimately, these reports all pull from the general ledger. And so if we're going back to the GL, so if we look at our general ledger accounts, one of the main differences that we'll see between Sage 100 and other systems that use a segmented chart of accounts in Sage Intacct, your natural account number is simplified, right? And so in this case, it's a 4-digit number. It could be 5, it could be 6. In this case, we're going with 4. I don't need within my account number to break out a program, to break out a restriction, to break out a fund, to break out a functional area, a location, an entity, none of that, right? My natural number can be simplified. So I only have 124 GL accounts here, right? When it comes to, if I needed the separate entities, if I needed, different programs and things like that, Intacct relies on dimensions. And so if we were to go under company, and let's say if I look at my departments, right? Best practice, we want to try to roll up our departments into our different functional areas. That's a best practice, that's a guideline. It doesn't necessarily need to be a rule if for whatever our organizational departments don't line up with our functional areas. But in this case, we'll assume that they do. And so we can go in here, we can see, you know what, under programs, I'm going to break out counseling services, youth center, outreach, food service. I have management in general as a functional area. I'm going to break out all of my essentially admin expenses in terms of accounting, IT exec. And you know what, I'm going to have a shared bucket because I'm going to need to move things around later on, right? And then I can even have fundraising, and I can have sub-departments there if I need to, right? But then that no longer needs to be buried into that segmented chart of accounts. And if there's accounts that don't have counseling service, for example, it doesn't just, those accounts or those new segments don't need to exist there, right? Because ultimately we can put logic in the system. So similar to what Eric mentioned earlier, under these accounts, we can require specific dimensions if we need to and say, hey, in this case, I'm going to require a fund. I could also choose to require a department. I could choose to require a funder or a donor or a vendor, an employee, a restriction, or a user-defined dimension, right? That's all, you know, specific to the individual GL account. So if there's accounts that don't need those combinations, we can leave them out. But ultimately, so it reduces complexity because we no longer have that segmented account, and then it gives us greater visibility because then we can track all these separate pieces, right? If we look at, for example, our restrictions. So this is, you know, the most common example that I've seen in my time with Sage Intacct, where these things are managed offline, right? And so managing like a TRNA schedule, all these different restricted values. It then becomes a large exercise for the end of the year, saying, you know what, we tracked our program or we tracked our grant, and then we're going to push it all out to Excel, and then we're going to figure out how much we needed to release, what's restricted, what isn't, right? Or I have separate accounts to track, you know, contributions that were restricted and ones that weren't. Within Intacct, we have this separate dimension. And so we can, this is actually natively the class dimension, but we rename it to restrictions. And so in this case, I have two main categories. I have without donor imposed restrictions, and I have with, right? Under without, I can have my unrestricted or general unrestricted, whatever I'd like to call it. And then I have my board designated. And then under with donor imposed, I have permanent and I have temp. I could break out temp, you know, another layer down if I needed to, if it's not already tracked in my funder or donor dimension, which is essentially my customer, or my project or grant, or anywhere else, right? I could go further. You don't have to just go to the two-step, right? But then we can track all this here. That way you take it out of Excel and it's all within the system. And at the end of the day, because we're no longer in Excel, we can actually look at something like this. So this is a TRNA roll forward that I created, you know, a while back in this environment. You can see that I live in 2022. But essentially what we're doing here is I'm pulling a beginning balance for my temp restricted net assets, right? And so based off that dimension, I know what that ending balance is, right? And then I can break that out by saying these are my active projects, my projects or grants. Maybe I have a contract in here that's all specific to the individual environment, and say, okay, so for Health Initiative 1, year ending 12/31/22, so my beginning balance, essentially my ending for 21, I don't have any restricted funds, right? I didn't receive anything, I'm good. But then I can say, okay, in 2022, this is my restricted revenue. I got 350K. I can drill down into this number. This is no longer in Excel where I need a note, you know, or an email, or it's filed away somewhere so that I know what this is. I can see that this is a grant deposit. I can drill down into that further and see the underlying receipt and where it went, the date, the bank account that it was deposited to. It's all together. I can see it went to grant income, right? And so that's my addition. Then I can break out, okay, what's my satisfaction of restrictions for that year? And so in that case, I released 140K, almost 141. And then I can see, okay, where is that coming from? So in this report, I've included expenditures because I'm going with the argument here where based on the expenses that I've incurred, that's the restricted revenue that I'm going to be releasing. And so then I can ultimately drill down into that number to then see, okay, what are all those expenses? Where are they coming from? So I got a bill from ransom counseling services. I got expense reports from Carla, and it seems like it's mostly Carla. So maybe me and Carla need to talk about why she's traveling so much, but it's all here. And then that rolls forward to my ending balance. That rolls to next year, right? So then when I need to roll forward these schedules to the next year, it's not this Excel, exercise, save PDF, the prior one, add columns, hide columns, move things forward, maybe hide rows because grants have fallen off, right? Based off their grant period. I don't have to do that. I just run it for the next time. So it's all there. And then it's all, for example, I can view it on a dashboard, right? Getting into multi-entity management. And so this is where we talked about with the segmented chart, we don't need to bury the location or the entity or the company code in the GL. But what happens when I need to manage multiple different entities? So in Intacct, you can see I have a top level. This is the container, right? So it's my top level container. It houses all of my individual entities. So you can see I have multiple here. They're all here as well. When it comes to adding them, as long as I have the right permissions, they can be imported, or I can point and click add. I list out an ID, I can list out a name, I can list out a federal ID, right? So my tax ID, that way it shows up for 1099 reporting. If this is like a US entity, I can bring all that in. I can bring in contact information. I can have a separate legal contact, right? To bring that in, I can have a separate fiscal month. So it doesn't have to be calendar. If I want to say, my fiscal year ends 6/30, so I start July, I can do that. I can start September, I can start October, I can start February if for whatever reason that's what it was, right? I get to customize that. It doesn't change anything for the rest of the container. It's just specific to this entity, right? On reports, I can break out the specific name that it needs to print on reports. If for whatever reason I want it to present a different way, I have flexibility. And that's kind of the main takeaway here is you have a lot of flexibility to bring in all this additional information we can add, whether it be through custom fields or standard fields, and it's all point and click, right? And in terms of once we have individual entities, let's say I had a ton of intercompany activity, right? So this all falls under multi-entity management within each. And I know this can be, a little scary because there's a lot here. If we focus on just row one, right? So what this means is within Intacct, with each individual entity relationship, I can say, you know what, this is my due from, this is my due to. I no longer have to hit these accounts. Auditors love this because then nobody's manually changing these, right? You can lock these down so that the only activity that goes through here are automated entries. So you can just kind of leave those alone. And it takes a lot of stress and work off of, accountants and staff. But then once you have the new entity, it's just adding a new row, right? So all point and click. And then in terms of multi-book functionality, and so as Eric mentioned, you can have cash and accrual, right? So you can have, if we look within general ledger and we go to our journal entries, we have individual journals for everything in here. You can see that all these go into this main accrual book. You could also have a cash book, right? If you needed to have cash versus accrual, you needed to report on both. On top of that, if you wanted to have a user-defined journal, you can. What would that be for? Tracking endowments, for example, right? If that needed to be tracked in a separate journal, those are separate schedules. They may not affect internal reporting, but you wanted to show, additional detail there. If you wanted to show a commitment book, right? That way you can track committed expenditures and you can view total spend, right? So that would be your actuals that you incur during the period plus all of these commitments that equals your total spend. You can then compare that to budget. That way you can then see, okay, what do I really have remaining once I include those committed expenditures? So those additional books help us for that. And then when it comes to just control of essentially this entire thing, Intacct has multi-ledger architecture. And so for each individual ledger, so let's say we have AP, our AP ledger, I can open and close that as needed. It's all permissionable. So let's say, for example, if the controller is the only one who has access to this, the controller is the only one that can actually do it. Nobody else can see it. But we can close things. So we can say, you know what, I want to close AP. I'm going to close East Lake Apparently Eastlake has never been closed before because it goes all the way back to 1970, and say, you know what, I'm going to close Eastlake through calendar year ended December 2013. I can do that. Now that's done, but only for AP, right? It doesn't affect the general ledger. I can do those separately. So when you're managing your close process, if it comes down to, you know, AP closes 3 or 4 days before the rest of the, you know, the GL and everything else, you can close that. AP can continue to work on the things that they need for the next period, and you kind of just keep moving forward. You don't need to open the next period. You're really focused on closing the previous. And then on the general ledger, we can close this and say, hey, I'm going to go back, I'm going to find Eastlake and say, you know what, I'm going to close Eastlake through June 2013. I can close it, right? Now that has closed the entire general ledger. This would mean that if I do an AR invoice that tries to affect that period, I'm going to get a warning because I've closed the GL. Everything filters down from the individual subledgers down to the general ledger, but you can close the subledger separately from the GL. And in the same step, if I needed to reopen something, I can go back to Eastlake. I could say, you know what, I'm going to reopen all the way back to January, reopen AP, reopen AR. Let's do cash management. Let's do time and expense. And I can reopen everything, right? You have that control. You have that flexibility. And then lastly, you can also lock periods. So if that's something that you needed to do, we could review that. And so that's just an example of some things that you can do in general ledger. You could also track budgets. You have standard reports here, right? All at your fingertips. If we were to look at our individual journal entries, right? And so, for example, I'm going to go down to my general journal because this is where I have all of these, and we're going to look at, for example, an intercompany journal. So within Intacct, journal entries can be manually keyed in. These can be imported. There's a standard template. Just save it as a CSV, load it into the system. You'll be fine. You can load them as a draft like this one is, or you can go ahead and post. You also have an approval workflow. So for each individual journal, you can track those a little bit differently. But so when we're looking at our journal entries, this is where we can see, for example, that segmented account that we no longer have, right? I could do something here where I'm just moving things between, you know, and then this particular allocation and this fund and department, right? So everything's hitting 5,300. But then based on my allocation, I'm hitting, you know, fund 100 in these different departments, right? So that's what I'm hitting, and everything's going or moving out of general. But then all of these end up becoming separate fields. And then if I were to post something like this, it'll run through. And then based on that intercompany relationship, it'll fill in anything in between if I needed it to, right? But you have that separate, you have that restricted value. That's all in your journal entry. So that covers our dimensional tagging, and all this has that full audit trail. So you can see, for example, you know, when this was originally drafted, so I messed with it back in January and I posted it today, right? That's all there. You could also push it out to Excel. You can duplicate it. You can reverse it. You'll also see there's memorized entries, and you can even create recurring journal entries in Intacct. And so the main difference between a standard journal entry and a recurring entry is going to be the schedule, right? This could be for, you know, prepaids, this could be for depreciation, this could be for, you know, any number of things. But so you essentially can dictate the schedule in terms of when is this going to start? When does this end? Do I want it never to end? Do I just want it to keep going forever? Do I want to end after a certain number of occurrences? Or do I have a specific date that I say, you know, I don't want to do this anymore? And then you dictate what is the repeating behavior? Is it just a one-time thing? Do I do it for every single day, every week, every month, or every year, right? And if you choose month, you get this little end of month checkbox. So the system knows whether to post it on 5/31 versus 4/30, right? So you can do all of that. And then specific for nonprofits, so we have this restriction release, right? And so what does this mean? So within the core product, nonprofits can come in here and generate a restriction release. So this is going to do that satisfaction of release entry that we looked at in that TRNA schedule before. And so what you're doing here is you're just going in and saying, as of what date am I going to run this? You know, what's the journal that this is going into, right? So I broke out a separate journal for just that restriction release. You know, what email address is this going to go to, so that I get a notification, did it pass or did it fail? These parameters are set at the very beginning when we run it for the very first time, and something that we covered during implementation. But essentially, the dimension in which we're tracking the restriction, aptly named restriction. That satisfaction of restriction GL account, so that's my 4900. What is my temp restricted designation? So that's, in this case, that temp restricted, that too. And what's my unrestricted designation? And then what is my qualified expense? Am I doing that based off the current month? Am I doing it month to date, quarter, quarter to date, year, year to current, year through prior month, right? I get to choose. And what's my reporting book? Am I doing it for accrual, or for example, if I had cash, am I going to do it on my cash book separately? My expense group, so this is based off expenditures. I could bring in additional books. So let's say, oh, I wanted to do this with my commitment book as well. So I wanted, that is what, you know, feeds into this qualified expense, or I didn't. What is that funding source dimension, right? And so where you're essentially your grants maintained. So that's our project or grant dimension. And then what filter am I doing this for? So you could leave this blank and run it for absolutely everything. You can group things together and say, you know what, run it for all my campaigns. Run them for my de minimis grants, my endowments, my events. Run it for just projects as a whole, right? Or I can choose a specific value, fill that in, and say, okay, go ahead and generate, right? Intacct will go try to run it. You'll see I've done it for 23 before because I don't have anything in January. Everything in this environment's in 22. But if we were to look at, for example, what does that ultimate entry look like? If I click view, it's going to pop this out. It'll load the journal entry that was created by the restriction release. And so it's hitting everything's hitting 4,900 because I'm not changing overall revenue. And you can see all I'm doing is I'm making a move. I'm debiting temp restricted and I'm going to credit unrestricted. That's all I'm doing. I've kept the fund, I've kept the department, my site, which is a user-defined dimension in this case. I've kept my project or grant, funder, here's my restriction, I have my memo. I can see all that there. I can see that it's for that 140, almost 141 that we saw earlier. If I wanted to click into see, okay, how did this get calculated? Under description, we have a hyperlink here. So I can click on that hyperlink and it gives you a little snapshot. It says, okay, this is what happened. It was as of 12/31/22. Same filters that we saw before when we were to go to run it for the first time. And then if we say, okay, what if I want to see that qualified expense calculation? I could click into that link. It's actually going to download in Excel. It'll open, and then this can be printed, this can be dispersed, you can go anywhere else. It always opens in 2007's version of Excel. But then you can see here, okay, here are my individual accounts, right? 5204, 5300, 305, 603, 604, right? These are the individual accounts. These are the other dimensions. Here's my vendor. Here's my employee. Here's my items. And then here's my balance, right? That's where all these came from. And that all adds up to the 146.55. So you can drill down from the very beginning all the way. So then ultimately that gives you all the way back to the dashboard, the view, so that you can see, okay, where did all that come from? Here's that same 140, right? It kind of takes you full circle, right? So that's all there. And so then ultimately all these things, you can display them on a dashboard, something like this. So if I just wanted to show the TRNA roll forward, the SEFA detail report, if I wanted to look at a statement of revenue, a statement of functional expense, you know, these can be pushed out as we mentioned before, and you could have as many different dashboards in Intacct as you need. So if you had like a nonprofit, there's a nonprofit board book here that has some canned dashboards. So if we wanted to have liquidity reports, you know, we wanted to look at profitability, revenue, resources as a percent of total, they're here. If we wanted to look at, you know, some balance sheet graphs or statements of functional position, they're here. And then same thing for the income statement or the statement of activity, right? So those are all there. All right.
Great, thanks. So we did want to highlight a success story that one of our nonprofit clients that has completed the switch that you're considering right now and is thriving. The Consumer Bankers Association is a trade association within the banking industry that was really struggling along on Sage 100. They had a massively bloated chart of accounts that led to extremely complicated reporting, tons of inefficiencies that really weren't their fault. They were just a result of an accounting technology that wasn't keeping up with the needs of their organization. With Sage Intacct, they were able to get rid of several 50+ page reports by utilizing the dimensions that Andres just showed you in Intacct to clean up their chart of accounts. These efficiencies gained allowed them to reclaim 30% of the time that they were spending every month and reallocate that time towards forward analysis. Every single workflow is designed to their specific needs, is more efficient and more straightforward. And we'd love to have a conversation with you to talk about the things that are hindering you right now and see how Intacct can help solve them in a similar fashion. So as we wrap this up, I think one of the things that we at DSD all love about Intacct is not just what it can do now, but where we see it going in the future. At the recent Sage Transform conference, they told us about a ton of exciting new features, including Sage Copilot, which is a next generation interactive tool that will allow you to easily unlock the power of the platform. Just imagine being able to tell your accounting system to run a set of financials for a specific period, like January 2024, walking away to refresh your coffee and coming back, and it's all been done for you. All you have to do is type in the command and let Sage Copilot do all the grunt work. We really thought this was a neat piece of technology that they were rolling out. They also announced some exciting new features catered towards nonprofits, like Sage Fundraising, and some enhanced features to the grant tracking and expenditure of funds that will allow for easier SEFA filing. All of this really just reinforces the commitment that Sage has made to supporting the missions of our nonprofit customers through Sage Intacct. And there's sure to be more announcements like that at the upcoming Sage Transform conference in November. We'd love for you to join us there. Please be sure to reach out to your account manager for more details. The final thing that we wanted to highlight is that Sage released the most recent version of Intacct on May 10th with tons of new quality of life features. Part of what we do at DSD, what we provide to our customers, is advance notice of these new features before released every quarter, so we can strategize together on what these new features mean for your business and develop a plan for you to help utilize them to the fullest. So with that, I think we're pretty much wrapped up on the presentation part.